How to Build a Bridge Between CX and UX, featuring new research and insights from today's presenter, Leah Bewley, Principal Analyst with Forrester Research. We will have a few minutes of Q&A at the conclusion of our presentation, and I'll follow up at the end with detailed instructions. We hope you enjoy the presentation, and with that said, we're ready to begin. Over to you, Leah.
Hi. Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining the webinar. I'm excited to chat with you today and share some research that I've been conducting. But to begin, let me just introduce myself so you know who's chatting with you. My name is Leah Bewley. I'm an analyst at Forrester Research, and I serve customer experience professionals generally, and my research area specifically is user experience. Prior to Forrester, I was a practitioner in the UX field for about 15 years, so I'm really interested in focusing at Forrester on how firms can really get the most out of the strategic asset that is user experience. So that's what I focus on. But what I found in just already at Forrester is a lot of people are asking, what is the relationship between user experience and customer experience? And what I've been seeing as I've been talking to people in different companies is the answer totally varies firm by firm. There really does not appear to be yet a very common blueprint for the way that CX and UX interrelate. So what I wanted to do in my research was to really dig into that question and undertake a study of what's really going on with CX and UX in different organizations, sort of thematically, and see what we can learn from that about how companies need to position these two really important disciplines in relationship to each other. So that's what we're going to be focusing on here today, and I'm excited to share with you what I've been learning. Here is the agenda that we're going to follow. We're going to begin by looking at the relationship between user experience and customer experience, and what I'll be sharing with you is the fact that they appear to be increasingly interconnected, more than ever before. But then we're going to look a bit at the state of the state in terms of how they actually configure themselves in relationship to each other in organizations, and we'll look at the fact that there really is no standard blueprint yet for them. We'll then turn our attention to the ways in which they are really important complementary disciplines that can support each other. And then we'll close by looking at how firms can really explicitly build a better bridge between UX and CX than they have today. And we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So that's the plan. So to start, let's look at how CX and UX are increasingly interconnected. So interestingly, CX and UX have matured along parallel paths. They were both as disciplines sort of born in the mid-90s, but they gained really significant traction in business in the early 2000s and then more in the late 2000s. And now each in its own way, I think, promises to solve a really important and confounding problem, which is how do you make a company's products and services better from a human-centered, sort of outside-in point of view? And how do you do that in a way that drives profit and loyalty and differentiation for your organization? And CX and UX, each in their way, ask this question, but they bring different approaches and they bring different influences to the way that they address this question. And now that both fields have reached a real point of maturity, what's happening is we're seeing firms that are investing significantly in CX and also investing significantly in UX. And those two disciplines find themselves now in mutual territory inside of companies. And that requires firms to figure out how they can and should work together. So let's look at that in greater detail. So first thing I think foundationally is just some basic definitions, because UX and CX certainly sound awfully similar, but what do they actually mean? So this is Forrester's definition of customer experience. Forrester says a customer experience is how customers perceive their interactions with your company. There's a couple things to note about this. Number one, it's customer-centric. It focuses on kind of people, the real human people on the other end of your product or your service. It's a definition that focuses not just on what customers can do or what they get from you, but more importantly, how they perceive that. So there's this interpretive layer that really requires a company to be curious about getting inside a customer's head. And this notion of how they perceive their interactions with your company means kind of every interaction. It encompasses a lot of touch points. It encompasses the concept of a start to finish journey or relationship that a customer has and that goes through in relationship to an organization. And so that means the products they're interacting with, the services they're getting from your company, the support they may be getting, even the marketing experience, all of that becomes part of the customer experience. So it's a pretty inclusive concept. Now let's contrast that with the definition of user experience. And there's a lot of definitions out there, but this is a good one. It comes from the International Standard on Ergonomics of Human System Interaction. Defines user experience as a person's perceptions and responses that result from the use or anticipated use of a product, system, or service. So similarly, here we have a focus not just on use, but also perceptions. It can be a product, a system, or a service, and it's very human-centric. It's about the kind of the end person on the other side of that relationship with a brand and kind of what they're getting out of it. So these two definitions have so much overlap in terms of the language that they're using, obviously. And it's not clear overlap. And that leads to so much splitting of hairs. It's what's the difference between a brand or a product or a service? What's the difference between a customer and a user? Is there a difference between a perception and an interaction? Does that even matter? And all of this language confusion has led to, I think, a real language problem for the field, for both fields actually. Here's a blurb from one agency website. The agency shall go nameless, but it really illustrates the kind of tortuous kind of language we're getting ourselves into with unclear definitions between the two. So this one says, we design incredible customer experiences with user experience, and that accelerates customer engagement, channel fluidity, and brand potency. So I imagine myself in the shoes of a buyer inside a company who's trying to figure out what we need, what help we need, what kind of agency support we need, what we need to focus our attentions on. And I read something like that and I think this is just creating more confusion than clarity. And I think a lot of people in both fields are feeling that pain as well. And so I think one thing that a lot of people have done is tried to kind of create a definition for them about the relationship between UX and CX that makes sense. I put this question to a discussion group that focuses on UX strategy on LinkedIn, and I put this question to a lot of people in companies who I've talked to, and even Forrester's own past research I've kind of mined. And there is, I think, a very popular interpretation that comes from all those different sources that says that UX is about digital product interactions. And it's one form of customer interaction, and it's under the broader umbrella of this concept of customer experience that also includes other non-digital touch points. So in that definition, UX is this smaller thing that sits inside the kind of universe of CX, and it's really for a subset of touch points, not all of them, digital touch points specifically. So this definition is popular. I hear it a lot, and I think it's one that in some senses makes a lot of sense, given that the user experience has such strong roots in the human-computer interaction field, given that so much of what user experience professionals do day in and day out is think about how to design digital experiences. But what I'd like to propose here today in this webinar and chat with you about further is that this definition, I think, is ultimately misguided. It leads organizations to bad behaviors that are not going to serve them well in the future customer experience offerings they're going to have to create. And the reason for that is it creates this sort of false distinction between UX as just digital and CX as kind of everything else, but also digital, but maybe not digital quite as deeply. And that distinction, it makes two things that seem more different from each other than they really are. And the reason this is a problem is because digital itself, the concept of digital, is reshaping every step of the customer journey. I think about it like a long snake. If you think about the customer journey as this sort of long snake that's sloughing off an old skin, it's like you go touch point by touch point by touch point, and every touch point now has the possibility of being reshaped, reframed, reimagined by digital customer interactions. So that's a pretty momentous change for the customer experience field and also for the user experience field. And it's going to require firms to think differently and behave differently across a variety of customer challenges. So for one example, omni-channel experiences. In an omni-channel experience, what's the CX part and what's the UX part? It's an increasingly kind of complicated concept. And it's complicated by the behaviors that we all have now in relationship to offerings that persist across a variety of different touch points. So 2/3 of US online adults, according to Forrester research, will routinely switch devices mid-task. That means you can't necessarily assume that you can just design the web experience and it's not going to have a relationship to the tablet experience or the mobile experience or even a face-to-face experience. Also, 2/3 of US online adults, according to Forrester research, have admitted that they have chosen a brand specifically because it provides a consistent experience over time. So what this means is that organizations have to think a little more holistically about how to design fluid experiences that span web and mobile and social and email and phone and in-person experiences, and to do that despite probably pretty unpredictable customer behavior. So how can customers have that consistent experience that starts in a digital realm and then moves fluidly into face-to-face interactions and maybe even finds its way into a support channel? These are broad experience design questions that have digital sort of throughout them, but they're not exclusively digital. So it messes and sort of muddies the relationship, I think, there between what is UX and what is CX. Interestingly, 28% of businesses say their multi-channel experiences are good or excellent, which means, with quick math, 72% say that they are not good or excellent. This is according to a recent IBM study. So omnichannel is an issue for many companies in many industries that they're still trying to figure out. And a strong divide between the concept of UX and CX is very problematic, I think, in that area. That's not the only one, though, because what we also see is that increasingly this idea that a digital experience sits in an interface that's on a screen is also not so true anymore. We now see that digital is becoming integrated into physical experiences, and so the idea of a whole experience platform that ultimately is experienced as a very physical, kind of in-person experience from the customer perspective, but that has a lot of digital integration and has moments that are kind of amplified and enhanced by digital, requires customers to think really differently about what it means to design an experience. Disney's Magic Band, which you see here on screen, sort of depicts that. And Vail Resort had Epic Mix, which they rolled out a few years ago. All of these are sort of really early examples of the digitally enhanced sort of physical experience, but we will certainly see more of them as beacon sensors make their way into stores and as the watches on our wrists change the experiences that we're having in physical environments. So experience platforms are going to require firms to think differently about CX and UX. And another area I think that this is going to kind of push on the boundaries between the relationships of CX and UX is in employee experiences. Within the CX field, there's actually this concept, the customer experience ecosystem, which is all the people and partners and sort of behind the scenes stuff that has to be well orchestrated in order to deliver a good experience to your end customer. And what we've been hearing from experience design agencies is that increasingly they're getting projects from customers, projects from companies that focus not so much on designing a better experience for end customers, but rather improving tools for frontline employees to then deliver better end experiences. So what's happening is companies are equipping their employees with systems, with experiences themselves that have to be really optimized in order to deliver kind of better customer experience. In the retail environment, this is showing up in a really kind of physical, high-profile way when you've got store associates who have these, now tablets or mobile devices in hand that in effect do mobile CRM and point of sale, and they're this really active third component in the face-to-face customer interaction that an employee is having with a customer. So all of this is just really breaking down the boundaries, in my view, of what is a digital experience versus what is sort of an other experience, and it's making it necessary for firms to really think about how they can infuse great user experiences throughout every moment in the customer journey. But the challenge, as I think I've mentioned, is that there isn't really a standard operating model for how firms do that yet. Let's look at some data to show kind of really the messy state that we're in. This is going to call on some research that I did late last year in 2014. It's a study that I sent out to CX and UX professionals. It may have been a little more weighted in the UX professionals who responded, so that's a bit of a caveat with it, but had a good blend of both. And we got 112 respondents, ranging from VPs all the way down to individual contributors. And among the questions that we asked was one, which is how are CX and UX represented in your organization? And the first thing I was really curious to know is, are CX and UX even in the same firm? Or is it just that some industries have CX and some industries have UX, and they kind of are the same concept, but they have different language? And what we saw with our survey respondents is there's some of that. First of all, there's a very small number of respondents who said they have CX but no UX. So it's very rare for a company to have decided that sort of the broad concept of customer experience is valuable to them, but the specific skills of UX are not, in their firm yet. It's a lot more common. 29% of respondents said that they have UX but no CX. And this is actually somewhat prevalent, we see, in smaller organizations or startups, particularly startups where UX is kind of considered a first five hire. It's heavily connected to the idea of design and the way that startup organizations think about UX. They kind of encompass in many ways some of the concepts of CX. But the larger share, definitely the larger group of respondents have both. They have CX and they have UX, but in 38% of their cases, they are not in the same part of their organization. So I saw this in lots of different firms that we talked to. What is often the case when you have this sort of UX, CX sort of divide or sort of set up in different parts of the organization is that UX is aligned with technology or maybe product, and CX is more aligned with marketing, or it may sit as a sort of standalone function as a peer to marketing and technology. And again, this varies very much firm by firm, but these are sort of broad strokes trends that are there. In the best of cases, what you see with this sort of 38% is that UX and CX sit together on some kind of formal body that is sort of horizontal across the organization, like a customer experience council or a kind of customer board. But what's a lot more common is to see that collaboration is taking place informally or maybe not even taking place at all. I talked to some UX professionals who said they don't even know where the CX professionals sit in their organization. So I think there's a lot of disconnect there. Now, 13% of respondents said that CX and UX are actually in the same group, and they're sort of working in a confederated way. Discover has this model. Kohl's, I believe, has this model, but it's definitely more the exception than the norm at this point. So we can't say that this is kind of where things have gotten to as in the state of the industry. And then just for completeness, we can look at sort of how the rest of the respondents replied, which is that about 19% of them don't really fit into any of the above categories because neither CX nor UX has been formalized or because they're currently in the process of really figuring out what that looks like. So here we have a really interesting story that to me says that for the most part, firms get that UX and CX are important, but they haven't yet figured out how to put those things together. And in a lot of cases, at least for the respondents of this survey, they get that UX is important, but they haven't yet figured out how to up-level it to the broader concept of CX. So that's what interests me for the purposes of this webinar, which is those 67% of respondents where CX is disconnected from UX, either because CX just isn't there or because it's not working, they're not working together. How can that really large number of firms make sure that UX is being applied to the bigger challenge of holistic experiences, that UX is helping to amplify digital across the entire customer journey rather than just limiting UX to a few digital touch points? And in short, how can companies connect UX to what we would think of as broader customer experience ambitions? So that's a question I want to dig into next. And what we're going to do is look at the ways in which UX and CX are complementary. It's kind of an interesting research challenge. You've got a messy sort of situation where there's no consistent model firm by firm. You can sort of see some broad trends from the survey. But how do we understand then what is the relationship between UX and CX, and what do these professionals really do day in and day out? And so what I tried to do in a way was to put the labels on the shelf. let's forget what we describe customer experience to mean, and let's forget what we describe user experience to mean. And instead, let's just try to understand what those professionals with those labels are actually doing in the course of their work every day. And for this, it turns out there's actually a really valuable source of data that's publicly available. You all have access to it, so do I, and it's job descriptions, job listings. If you mine job sites and try to sort of standardize what you're seeing across customer experience jobs and across user experience jobs, it turns out there are some really common themes and some important differences and a few really interesting areas of shared responsibility. And that's what I want to dig into next. So what I did is I basically pulled 50 different job descriptions aligning to customer experience and user experience titles. And I went through and I kind of ignored all the stuff you usually find in job descriptions, like, be able to collaborate and clear, written and verbal communication. And I just tried to pick out what are the things that feel really distinct to those roles. And the first interesting finding was that the roles themselves actually align really closely to this concept of the 6 customer experience disciplines that we write about a lot at Forrester, which you see on screen in front of you. So Forrester kind of has a point of view that if you want to have customer experience maturity, you need to be advancing along all of these 6 areas within your organization. You need to be formulating a customer experience strategy that's well informed. You need to be conducting customer understanding activities that include research and data gathering to help your organization have an accurate understanding of who the customer is, and empathy, if possible, for that person. You need to be conducting experience design activities. You need to be measuring the outcome of that work and determining if it's hitting your benchmarks. We recommend that you think about your governance structures, and we also say that it's important to think about the overall firm culture and the way that that actually fosters customer centricity. And so if we think about these 6 disciplines and how the CX roles and the UX roles align with them, there's some interesting findings. First, for the CX role specifically, we found a strong clustering of responsibilities that are aligned in the areas of measurement and governance. So for many of the CX pros, the job descriptions there, their job, really a very significant portion of their job is to define, collect, and analyze CX success metrics. And there's a lot of specific metrics that are called out. NPS, many of the jobs we saw actually require somebody with past NPS experience or somebody who has been certified as an NPS associate. There is a strong emphasis on the Net Promoter Score as a core metric that that a CX pro is sort of is monitoring and helping to kind of report out. But they're also actually expected to understand how other very quantitative tools fit into this. So 4C Medallia, those are some that are called out. And also to mine data from call centers and even competitive data from the industry. All of this ultimately to create kind of a dashboard or a sort of an understanding of how the firm is doing against kind of key indicators of customer satisfaction and a successful and healthy customer experience practice. That's measurement. In the governance category, CX pros are really very frequently expected to inform and enforce and create policies, procedures, standards for what good customer experience interactions look like. In the course of this, they also have a lot of responsibilities frequently around training and learning initiatives. So how do you help essentially educate an organization about what a good face-to-face customer interaction should look like, or what the core principles of our customer experience should be? Finally, customer experience pros we see in these job descriptions have lighter responsibilities in the area of culture, or let's say less defined responsibilities, because culture comes up a lot in the job descriptions, but the expectations for what one does to foster culture are pretty loosey-goosey if there's just sort of a general nod to the idea that you're helping to foster culture. So these requirements don't come through quite as strongly or consistently in the job descriptions as the clear expectations for measurement and governance do, but they're there, certainly. So how does that contrast to some of the core requirements that we see for user experience? Well, when it comes to user experience, we see the bulk of the work, a big portion of the work is really in the category of design. And that includes a variety of activities around design. It includes kind of fostering and participating in ideation. It includes bringing in expertise about design trends and industry best practices. It includes prototyping and testing, all of that with the goal of driving design solutions into products and services. And interestingly, although UX professionals are expected to have, in most of these job descriptions, technical knowledge, technical background, the drive design solutions part of the job doesn't necessarily prescribe a technology. So there is a sense that the design process itself should be technology agnostic, but there's a sort of technical domain in there somehow. The other interesting thing is that UX professionals have a little bit of responsibility in the area of governance too, but it's much more specifically trained on kind of brand standards, policies, not policies, let's say guidelines, design patterns and guidelines, things that the organization should use as a kind of touchstone to know how to roll out and extend kind of core design solutions. So there's a little bit of overlap in that category of governance, but definitely stronger emphasis for customer experience professionals based on what we see in the roles that companies are trying to hire for right now. Now, what about strategy and customer understanding? Because I haven't filled those in yet. Well, here, what we see is that both customer experience and user experience have a lot of responsibilities. And based on the job data that we reviewed, they appear to actually be potentially in conflict at times. So CX pros are expected to set experience strategy and drive customer understanding efforts, and so are UX pros. CX pros are often, they're setting a strategy, but the background that they are kind of expected to bring into the organization to do this is often people are looking for someone who's been doing work in operations or who has a quantitative analysis background, and it's really common that CX pros are expected to have an MBA. Meanwhile, the UX pros are expected to set strategy, but the word that gets used in probably 80% of cases in these job descriptions is vision, strategy and vision. And in the UX field, vision conceptually isn't just saying kind of this is where we're going to place our bets, but it's creating that kind of notional and inspiring picture of what it'll look like when we get there from the customer's point of view. So that's a really different definition of what a strategy is from the MBA kind of definition of what a strategy is. The other thing that's interesting here is that there's a pretty strong distinction between the types of research that these two different professionals do. So CX professionals, their research, it tends to be more quantitative. It tends to plug in really strongly to those measurement requirements. So the work that they're doing is intended to essentially cull from systems like Voice of the Customer, to cull from any segmentation work that has been done, and to cull from other kind of customer listening posts, and to understand sort of where the need is and where the pain is from the customer perspective. And I will say this is general. I've definitely had I've had conversations with many CX professionals who are deeply steeped in more qualitative methodologies, but looking at this broad set of data, these are broad themes that are definitely present from a kind of CX versus UX perspective. Meanwhile, UX professionals, they're often expected to bring a background in cognitive psychology or anthropology or design or human-centered design as just kind of core foundation for their job. And then there's a big emphasis on shaping kind of custom research and then creating models for customer understanding that are sort of not predefined. That in contrast to something that comes up a lot in customer understanding for customer experience professionals, which is journey maps. So you can see right here in these different job descriptions that there's a high likelihood that customer experience professionals and user experience professionals are drawing on different sources of data to understand who the customer is. They're leveraging different models to help make that clear to the organization. Probably on the CX side, a bigger emphasis on journey maps, and on the UX side, maybe a more custom approach to sort of how you model customer insights, although definitely a big emphasis on personas and scenarios and user stories. And then they use all that to form a strategy that may, if they're working in different parts of the organization, not actually ever align, or even if they are sort of aligned, they may speak to different parts of what a strategy entails, the vision versus the plan. So these differences are fascinating to me because from my point of view, I find myself, I have to ask, should an organization be concerned that strategy and customer understanding might have these sort of sources of conflict sort of right built in? But I think when I think about it, it seems to me to be an opportunity area as well. And I think that's what I'd like to dig in to a little more as we talk about how to build a bridge between customer understanding. So I'm going to be very overly general here and say, and this I'm sure for if you're a CX professional listening or a UX professional listening, this may not apply to all of you, but I think based on the research I've been doing and the themes I'm seeing, it's definitely there. I feel like you can say in a very broad strokes that customer experience professionals tend to be more focused on assessing the quality of the experience and figuring out where to fix it, whereas user experience professionals tend to be more focused on kind of creating the quality of the experience and sort of figuring out where to place their efforts in that. And to me, this is a very kind of promising sort of yin and yang relationship where there's an inbuilt tension, but it doesn't have to be a bad tension. It's a productive tension potentially. And for what I mean here, actually, I feel like it aligns to larger trends that we're seeing in industry, where you've got kind of, so I'm based in San Francisco, so we see a lot of this in Silicon Valley. You've got this kind of customer-centric innovation practice that's popularized by, the Stanford D School, and it's coming out of IDEO, and it has, definitely sort of tentacles into lean startup kind of methodologies. And the whole concept here is you may not know what your plan is up front, but you make something and you put it in front of people and you learn by doing, and therefore a strategy sort of comes to be. And I think that has a lot of roots in the software development world, and it has a lot of roots in sort of design thinking methodology, and it is definitely an approach that I see a lot of user experience professionals taking. And then you've got customer experience professionals who may be more likely to come out of MBA programs or operations focused disciplines. And for them, in a sense, they are more of the enterprise. They have more of the legitimacy that comes with hard numbers and dashboards and understanding from a quantitative way where you can diagnose a problem and where you expect to see the output and the impact from addressing that problem. And this tension being of the enterprise, being sort of the software, between the two of them, for me, they're really about the natural tension that's in the market today between today's agile customer-centric approaches and traditional business practices, which are still, of course, how things are run. So the modest proposal, in a sense, that I would like to put forth in terms of how to build a bridge between UX and CX is to think about these two different perspectives as the source for better pressure testing your own strategy and creating a richer understanding of the customer that brings sort of the best of both perspectives. So I'm going to focus specifically on customer understanding and strategy as the core areas there because that's where we see the interesting overlap. The first thing that firms have to do to build a bridge then between customer experience and user experience is to accept that both UX and CX have valuable data to understand customers. And until they do a better job at stitching that data together, they're going to be thwarting deeper customer understanding. So what I like to do is think about in a sense, think about kind of the quantitative data that often comes through kind of the CX angle as sort of giving you a picture of what is happening, and the UX data that often comes through some of the more qualitative approaches as sort of why that's happening. There's a spectacular podcast called Dollars to Donuts, actually, that interviews a number of UX researchers about their roles, and there was a really great interview with a researcher from Edmunds.com not long ago, and she explained a really fascinating process where the sort of customer insights and the analytics folks are getting a really clear picture of what kinds of customers exhibit the most valuable behavior on their website, and then that leads to essentially interviewees, leads that they want to actually go out into the field to understand better, to then get a deeper and richer understanding of the kind of messy story of those users' lives and what's motivating them to behave in the way that they do. So that sort of kind of beautiful integrated way of thinking about how you can understand quantitatively where your most valuable and important customer behaviors are coming from, and then qualitatively get the full backstory is I think a best practice for kind of how to think about how to connect CX and UX. There's one good example of this that comes from Staples. Staples basically did a bunch of work to create personas, and they did this in sort of exactly the way that you're supposed to. They did first-person kind of qualitative research and put together a pretty robust set of personas, but as an organization they wanted to validate them and make sure that they were really real. And so they used their website actually as a tool to quantitatively kind of prove out whether the personas were right. So essentially they put up a couple of questions to visitors of the website, and the questions essentially helped how the visitors responded in a way helped bucket them into the sort of expected persona groups. And then they basically tracked the behavior and the buying habits of the people who are on the site. And based on how they responded to those questions, they were able to sort of prove out that this type of persona, this person who responds this way to these questions, does in fact exhibit these behaviors on our website and has a cart size, a purchase total that corresponds to the behavior that we expect. So they, as an organization, thought about how to kind of connect that CX and sort of UX understanding of the customer. Another good example of this, I think, comes from MailChimp, which has an interesting case study of how they've been trying to just sort of stitch together all the information they have about customers. There's a good article about this from Aaron Walter, who's a director of design at MailChimp. It's called Connected UX on the website A List Apart. And Aaron sort of describes this, I don't know, aha moment where he got an email late at night from his CEO asking him for some information about how customers use RSS to email, which is a feature they were considering. And so he'd been funneling some customer support emails into an Evernote account, and he quickly searched just for the phrase RSS to email in Evernote and returned, as he describes it, 45 extremely helpful pieces of customer feedback, which then made it possible to recruit those specific customers. And he says it made the process of recruiting for research like spear phishing. We just found the right people to speak with in seconds. So that led to a broader effort at MailChimp where now they basically funnel all of their customer data and things even sort of tangentially related to customer data into a shared Evernote account. So feedback forms, Google Analytics data, tweets, blog comments, email delivery stats, industry research, account closing information, user research studies, all of that stuff is in this really large, probably pretty unstructured data set in Evernote. But what it does is it makes it possible for anybody who's sort of working on anything related to customer understanding to quickly search and find out all the knowledge that's there. So these are examples of building a bridge effectively using tools. The second area that I want to focus on is how to build a bridge from the perspective of strategy. And here, this is where I think the key is to encourage, not discourage, the productive tension that may exist between the sort of CX approach and the UX approach to strategy. So the idea that there's a need to set a strategy up front, I think, is absolutely right. And the idea that there's a need to determine what the success metrics would look like and what the KPIs are going to be, that's all absolutely right. And even to start to document and standardize kind of what that should look like as the organization rolls it out, that all is absolutely right. But there's also the reality that the strategy changes often when it goes out into the wild. Customers can confound strategy. They say culture eats strategy for lunch. I think customers sometimes use strategy for lunch too. And the user experience process of sort of setting a vision for what the experience should be, prototyping it, and then through the process of customer interaction, refining and learning about what the experience really ultimately ought to be, that I think is a way to kind of shape the strategy to the customer in a manner where it sort of learns from customer behavior. So a couple examples of this, kind of, you definitely see it more in the startup world, but there's a lot of examples in startups of famous pivots, and the pivot concept is essentially the strategy sort of learning from the customer behavior. And Pinterest is a pretty big famous pivot. Pinterest actually started out as a website called Tote, and the idea of Tote was that it was going to replace the paper catalogs that you get in the mail, and that you could just buy then from the website. And they had a product out, it had a nice monetization model, but it turned out that customers simply weren't using it to buy in the numbers that Tote would need to be successful. But by having this sort of working product and sort of seeing how people interacted with it, they were able to see that the process of collecting and sort of curating was actually creating pretty deep customer engagement. And through that sort of observation, they got more curious about the concept of collecting and the meaning of collecting in customers' lives, and realized that was actually the true opportunity, and that's when they pivoted to become Pinterest. So that's a really great example of strategy sort of shaping itself around the customer as the customer gets to kind of interact with the experience. Another good example, I think, comes from Airbnb, where they've sort of famously talked about how their strategy really changed when they actually they flew out to New York early on in their journey as a product, and looked at people's apartments and realized that if they could actually have good professional photographs of the apartments, it would be a much more appealing experience for people who might want to stay there. So they made this very unscalable decision to get professional photographers to photograph all listings. And within a week, they proved that professional photographers doubled weekly revenue to $400 a week because they had not been profitable. It was very early days, but it's a really great example of sort of getting close to the customer and getting close to the experience itself to actually understand how to shape your strategy. And they still, in a sense, have that philosophy really built into the organization in a lot of ways. At Airbnb, all new employees are encouraged to take a trip within their first week to get a sense of the user experience firsthand. And in this sort of spirit of launching and learning from the launch, new employees are also encouraged to ship early, very early, like on their first day, if you can. There's an example that came from a recent article on firstround.com, where basically Airbnb had a new designer who was encouraged to ship as soon as possible, and so this designer looked at the site and sort of had a hunch that the star feature that was used to indicate that you might be interested in staying at a rental didn't feel as connected to the brand as it could be. So they changed the design to a heart instead of a star, and they found that the heart increased engagement by 30%. So really quickly letting people kind of get into the product and change the product experience to then learn how to further kind of refine the strategy from there is a really interesting practice that can come from connecting sort of CX and UX more directly. So I've been talking a lot. I'm going to close with some thoughts on how to build a bridge between CX and UX, or close with a summary, let's say, of the thoughts I've been sharing. So the first thing is to stop accepting that the digital divide is a reasonable way to slice and dice customer experience and UX. That is, I think, a self-fulfilling prophecy that ironically will keep digital experiences fragmented. Rather, embrace the idea that there's a strong design discipline that's already in-house in the form of your UX team, but it needs and must be informed by the measurement and the numbers that the customer experience professionals are very adept at gathering. So rather than talking about channels and sort of setting up CX and UX and sort of the concept of touch points and channels, I like to think about them in relationship to the 6 customer experience disciplines that we looked at. And I would propose that one way that firms can build a bridge between CX and UX is when they're thinking about taking on a customer experience initiative, assess their bench strength within each of those 6 disciplines, and then deploy the resources where there's a strong skills fit, regardless of whether that resource happens to have a UX title or a CX title. And that applies to UX projects, and it applies to CX projects. It should be a cross-pollination of skills. The second recommendation for how to build a bridge between CX and UX is to follow the lead of companies like MailChimp and Staples and become more disciplined about kind of sharing data about who the customer is and trying to understand in a kind of comprehensive way how you can bring all of that data together to create a complete picture. I think this is going to be a really interesting thing to watch from the market perspective, because this is a hard thing to do without good tools. And as an industry, there aren't a lot of really good tools, I think, right now for CX and UX to kind of bring all this information about the customer together into a holistic picture. So instead, what you get is people passing PowerPoints back and forth to each other across an organization. So I think keeping an eye on how people are using tools like Evernote, and Tandem7 actually has Tandem7's own UX 360 as a tool also in this space. I think it'll be really interesting to see how firms are adopting these tools and what that makes possible for them. The third recommendation here for how to build a bridge between CX and UX is to create structures that support collaboration between customer experience and user experience. So the idea of a customer experience council or a customer council as a sort of lateral body that crosses the silos is one good way to do that if you have them. If your organization doesn't have that sort of thing, even just setting up regular meetings and operating mechanisms between the CX arm and the UX arm is a starting point. And I also think within a project or a program, there are so many kind of workshop points, kind of connection points, bringing in cross-functional colleague points. And it sounds so simple, but making sure that UX and CX are both really actively participating in those collaboration opportunities is going to be what firms are going to have to do if they want to build a bridge between CX and UX. And finally, my last recommendation, in a way, is not about what CX and UX do with each other, but it's almost, or do between each other, let's say. It's more focused on what they do together in relationship to the rest of the firm. So here, what I think is interesting is, can CX and UX join forces, in a sense, to make sure that best practices for the kind of the broader sort of 6 disciplines become built into internal programs and processes throughout the organization? Airbnb, again, as an example, they now staff every project with a program manager who is tasked with representing the user. And that ensures that the kind of constructive conflict when timelines and user centricity are in tension is confronted head on, but that requires pretty good coordination between the parts of the organization that think about UX and the parts of the organization that think about CX to partner with their other colleagues to help inform what a typical product kind of development process ought to be to deliver on better customer experiences. So that's the fourth and final recommendation for how to build a bridge between CX and UX. So that's a lot, and it's been a lot. It's been a pleasure to share some of this research with you, and I'm really eager to understand what questions you have about it and to dig in a little further. So at this point, I'd like to turn to Q&A.
Thank you, Leah. For those of you with questions, please submit them via the webinar control panel to the right of your screen. If we run out of time and don't get to you during the Q&A session, we will follow up with you directly via email following the event. So at this point, I'll just go ahead and pass it back to you for questions, Leah.
Okay, good. So we have our first question comes from John with Experience by Design. John asks, how can we get UX out of the confines of the design box that perpetuates the stereotype that UX is primarily a creative exercise with little or no analytical, problem solving, or strategic input to business challenges or operations? That's a great question. So I think the first sort of, so let's first of all, let's acknowledge that the question, I think, is an accurate reflection of what a lot of companies think about UX as today still, which is kind of user interface design only. And I think the first step to moving beyond that, frankly, kind of outdated view of user experience is to make sure that your organization is starting to bring user research into the design process. Honestly, if you're not doing some form of user research, you can't call it user experience. I mean, the concept of user experience is it's a human-centered design process that takes contact with users as an input into design decisions that then get validated through subsequent contact with users, or as I like to call it, the research sandwich. So anyway, the first sort of maneuver, the first recommendation is to make sure that research is a component of design activities. And what happens when that first step takes place is that the sort of user experience team starts to bring better evidence to support design decisions that help the organization see that design is not just kind of the hunches of the UX people or even just kind of broad heuristics, but it actually, it is a process itself that includes research and brings data from research. It's often the case that people start with usability testing as that first form of research, and that's really valuable, but I think you start to up-level user experience and bring it further into strategic conversations when you do that first half of the research sandwich, which is upfront exploratory research to understand what customers' needs are for the product or the service. So just kind of finding a way to make time within the process for that research to happen is, I think, that first step. And a lot of companies, a lot of UX professionals and UX teams struggle with getting sort of permission for that research to happen from their organizations. But certainly within our data, in the Forrester research that we've done, we see that conducting research into unmet customer needs is a hallmark and a best practice of customer-centric organizations. It is a core to one of the 6 disciplines of customer experience, and if your company says they want to provide good end experiences to their customer, that's something they can't really skimp on. So starting to make that case, I think, becomes very important. And then through that research activity, what happens is you start bringing insights from the field that actually help people learn a little bit more about assumptions that perhaps have been made in the strategy and whether they're right or they're not. So research is, long story short, start with research, and that will help everyone sort of see design in a different way. We have another question from Nicholas. What should an organization that is creating a UX group today but has no CX group do? Should the UX group also perform what the traditional CX practice is? That's a great question. I mean, I think it really depends on who the organization is to a certain extent. What I see is pretty common is there are companies that are sort of born digital or that are software focused, where UX in a sense does take on more of that CX leadership role, just because when you're doing the necessary research to inform the design process, you inevitably start wading into web analytics and a little more sort of market research, and you start to kind of have that broader purview. But at a generally, I would say if your organization doesn't have CX, it's probably appropriate and good for UX to try to be advancing that conversation about customer experience in the organization, but not to be naive about the other skills that are not common to UX that are also necessary. So specifically those sort of measurement and governance and culture skills that UX teams in many cases are not expert at. Help the organization understand that stuff is needed, and exert a leadership role there if you have those skills. But if not, help your organization figure out who is the best candidate for a leadership role in those areas, and help your organization beef up in those capabilities. And I think that will make you, from a user experience perspective, a more credible partner in the long run. A really good place to look for an ally in that area is often a kind of customer insights team, or anybody who's doing kind of market research can be a really good partner from the measurement front. Okay, let's see. I'm looking here. Here is one question. Hold on, I'm looking in this little window. Let me get my hand back on it. You talked a lot about data in your presentation. Can you speak to the benefits or limits of qualitative UX bias versus quantitative data CX bias? So yeah. Qual and quant, I think, yeah, this is the big dividing line in how a lot of people think about CX versus UX. And so here's what I would say. I'd say quantitative generally is about understanding if a trend that you're seeing is big enough to pay attention to. So the quant work will tell you, if you're doing a survey, that a sizable enough percentage of customers are having a problem with this important thing that you probably need to dig into it. Or segmentation analysis from a quantitative perspective will tell you that enough of the market is worth addressing that you probably want to make an investment there as a company. And that level of that kind of barometer of like, yep, we've reached the threshold to pay attention to this is extremely important as a decision-making tool for an organization. So it sort of serves that goal really well. But what quant doesn't necessarily do for you is tell you kind of what to do about it necessarily. The qualitative research is a really good companion to quant, just for getting into sort of specific insights about the needs of a particular customer group, or why a problem is appearing in the large numbers that it is. So even just with a sort of a small pool of customers, you can do quick qual research, and you can come back with some pretty meaty insights that tell you, not just we need to fix it, but we could fix it in one of three ways, and in fact, this third way is probably going to be the most likely to support what people want. Qual is, it can only, the limitations of qual is that if you start with that, it doesn't give you that sort of sense of the size of the trend and the significance of the trend from a kind of magnitude perspective. It doesn't help you know if the trend is sizable enough. So what I'm seeing a lot of organizations who I would say are exhibiting best practices in this area do is kind of ping pong back and forth between quant and qual. They'll start with a survey maybe that will tell them a little bit of something, and then they'll do some qual research to understand some insights about it, and then they'll put a solution in place, and then they'll follow up with more of a some kind of quantitative measure to understand how broadly the solution is sort of serving people. So it's not sort of kind of religious dedication to one methodology or another, but sort of working them off of each other. The other sort of thought I have in this area, and it's sort of, I need to do a little more research on it, but so maybe it's just a hypothesis at this point, but I kind of think this quant versus qual is sort of a false distinction, or is becoming one for leading companies in terms of how they think about customer insights. You've got a lot of business questions, a lot of questions pertaining to your customer, and you've just got a toolkit of different ways to answer them. And some of the more sophisticated user research teams that I'm seeing, they just kind of pick the right tool for the question they have. Referencing again that podcast, Dollars to Donuts, there was a really good interview with Alex Wright, who's at Etsy. And he says that on their user research team now they have quantitative user researchers, they have qualitative user researchers, and they also partner with other kind of quantitative teams in the organization. And so it's not like they have to be dedicated to one discipline. They can sort of, they can use the tools in the toolkit to answer the questions they need to have. Let's see. Okay, we've got time, I think, for one last question. This one, Henry from Henry Nakamura, can you elaborate on some of the KPIs or metrics that drive CX programs or initiatives? I think different companies will kind of assemble their own sort of dashboards in a sense of the most important metrics to them, but it's what's most common, I would say, as a starting point for organizations is to figure out what is a kind of base satisfaction metric that they can sort of instrument to be looking at the customer experience and understand at a kind of for a baseline, where are they today in terms of customer satisfaction, and sort of where do they want to be. So some people will use NPS for that. Some people will use JD Power. Forrester actually has we have a measure called CX Index that some people use. So that's kind of one sort of thumb in the wind measure that many organizations will use just to see if they're trending kind of positively or negatively. And then second from that, it's very common to see an organization set up a kind of overall voice of the customer program that has listening posts at social channels, at kind of in the contact center, in any digital channels that get, that solicit feedback from customers, and those things get sort of funneled into tools that can help you see issues that start to be sort of trending out, and can kind of assign a number to kind of how prevalent those issues are. So it isn't to say necessarily that, that if you're thinking about kind of a listening post, that what a source of customer feedback for one industry or for one type of company may be very different from another one, so it's hard to sort of generalize across. But the idea that there is a comprehensive program that's kind of put in place and that has routine mechanisms for bringing that data back into the organization tends to be very important. And then, again, it depends on the industry, but I think what I see is a lot of CX teams who are trying to figure out really what is the impact of CX improvements on important things like share of wallet or long-term or like lifetime value of a customer. And even trying to find out if they can measure kind of components like loyalty. So it's big business and it's complicated business, I think, to really measure the effectiveness of a CX program, which is why it's appropriate that there are people who have that as their job. And I think the key from a UX perspective is to make sure that as a partner to CX, we're savvy enough about the importance of those measures that we ask for them as an input into UX work, and be aware of the ways in which an organization is measuring the quality of the customer experience. So on that, I see we're at the hour, so I just want to thank you guys again for joining me. I really appreciate that you took the time to share in this research, and I'm happy to connect further afterwards if anybody has any questions. My email is lbewley@forrester.com. It's pretty straightforward. So thanks, and thanks Tandem7 for hosting this webinar.
Great. Thank you again, Leah. Great questions, everyone. Like I mentioned before, if we didn't get to your question, we will follow up with you directly. We hope you all enjoyed today's presentation and invite you to visit our website at www.tandem7.com or reach out with additional questions to info@tandem7.com. Also, be on the lookout within the next 24 hours for your copy of Leah's recent report, Bridging the CX-UX Divide, and the recording of today's webinar. Thank you all again for joining us today, and enjoy the remainder of your day.